January 17th, 1944. Rostenburg, East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair. Snow fell in thick curtains beyond the reinforced concrete walls. Inside the command bunker, the air tasted of cigarette smoke and wet wool. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood before a large tactical map of Western Europe, his finger tracing a line through the Norman countryside toward Paris. The overhead lamps cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines that 2 years of desert sun and a year of nervous anticipation had carved there. He spoke with the clarity of a man who had learned his lessons in blood and sand. "Gentlemen," Rommel said, his voice steady but urgent, "when the invasion comes, we will face a commander unlike any we have encountered. He will not follow doctrine, he will not telegraph his intentions, and if we attempt to meet him with classical defensive postures, he will destroy us piecemeal." Around the table sat officers whose uniforms bore the insignia of the Wehrmacht's finest divisions. They exchanged glances, some skeptical, others merely tired. One, a colonel from the general staff with a monocle and an iron cross, cleared his throat. "With respect, Herr Field Marshal, intelligence suggests the Americans are predictable. Eisenhower is cautious, Bradley is methodical. Their advantage is material, not tactical." Rommel did not raise his voice. He simply placed a folder on the table. Inside were reconnaissance photographs, intercepted communications, and his own handwritten notes compiled over 18 months of studying Allied operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. "You are not listening," he said quietly. "I am not speaking of Eisenhower or Bradley. I am speaking of Patton." The room fell silent. Outside, the wind howled against the bunker's steel door. Somewhere in the distance, a generator coughed and resumed its monotonous hum. Erwin Rommel had earned his reputation honestly. In France in 1940, he had raced his tanks through the Ardennes faster than his own supply lines could follow. In North Africa, he had turned the desert into a chessboard where maneuver mattered more than mass. British officers grudgingly called him the Desert Fox, a predator who understood terrain, timing, and the psychology of his enemy. But Libya and Tunisia had taught him something else, something that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The Americans were different. It was not merely their numbers, though those were staggering. It was not only their material wealth, though their Sherman tanks arrived faster than his mechanics could repair broken Panthers. It was their tempo. American commanders operated at a speed that violated European conventions of war. They did not consolidate, they did not pause to perfect their logistics before resuming the offensive. They attacked, and when they met resistance, they attacked somewhere else, and when that failed, they attacked again, because they could. They had the fuel, the ammunition, the replacements, the radios, and, most unsettlingly of all, the willingness to risk catastrophic failure in pursuit of breakthrough. And among those commanders, one name haunted Rommel's thoughts: George S. Patton, Jr. They had never met face to face, but Rommel had studied him the way a hunter studies tracks in the snow. Patton had commanded American armor in Morocco and Tunisia. His methods were unorthodox, aggressive to the point of recklessness. At El Gaitar, he had baited German forces into overextending, then slaughtered them with massed artillery and a counterattack that came from an unexpected axis. In Sicily, he had raced Montgomery to Messina, not because it mattered strategically, but because he wanted to win. Patton fought wars the way Americans built factories, with overwhelming energy, minimal patience, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations. In the months after returning from North Africa, Rommel was assigned to inspect the Atlantic wall defenses stretching from Norway to Spain. What he found alarmed him. The fortifications were impressive in places, bunkers of reinforced concrete, minefields, beach obstacles, but they were static. They assumed the Allies would land, dig in, and fight a siege. Rommel knew better. The Allies, and Patton especially, would never fight the battle Germany prepared for them.
He drafted report after report. He argued for mobile reserves positioned close to the coast. He insisted that the critical battle would be won or lost in the first 48 hours before Allied air superiority turned every road into a killing zone. He warned that Patton, wherever he landed, would not push forward cautiously. He would erupt, driving deep into the rear before German command could react. The High Command listened politely. Then they filed his reports and returned to their own plans, which assumed that the invasion, when it came, would be a methodical affair, an expansion from a beachhead that could be contained, reduced, and eventually thrown back into the sea. They believed the Allies would behave rationally, which meant slowly. Rommel knew they were wrong, and he knew why they were wrong. They had never faced Patton. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The invasion came at dawn, not where Rommel had expected, though he had been closer than most. The beaches of Calvados erupted in flame and noise as thousands of ships disgorged men, tanks, and supplies onto French sand. In the chaos, Rommel raced back from Germany, where he had been visiting his wife. He arrived to find his worst fears confirmed. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, and now the question was whether the Allies could be contained before they broke out into the French interior. For weeks, the battle raged in the hedgerows, small, brutal engagements where terrain negated Allied advantages. The bocage country of Normandy was a defender's dream, each field a miniature fortress. German forces, outnumbered but dug in, made the Allies pay for every kilometer. British and Canadian forces ground forward toward Caen. American units pushed through marshland and villages with names no one could pronounce. And all the while, Rommel waited for the other shoe to drop, because Patton was not there. Allied intelligence confirmed it. The general who had terrorized Sicily was being held back. The Germans, desperate for any advantage, seized on this. Perhaps Normandy was a feint. Perhaps the real invasion would come at Calais, where the channel was narrowest, and Patton would lead it. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest force in France, remained stationed there, waiting for an attack that would never come. Rommel did not believe it. He had studied Patton's mind long enough to understand. The man was being held in reserve not because Normandy was a diversion, but because it was the main effort. Patton was a weapon the Allies would unleash at the decisive moment when the front had cracked just enough for exploitation. He would not land on a beach. He would enter through a door someone else had kicked open, and when he did, he would not stop until he reached the German border or until someone killed him. August 1st, 1944. Avranches. The breakout came faster than even Rommel had predicted. Operation Cobra shattered the German lines south of the Cotentin Peninsula. American bombers turned the landscape into a moonscape, and through the smoke poured American armor, hundreds of tanks, infantry carriers, trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition. Within days, they had seized Avranches, a town whose bridges opened the way into Brittany and, more ominously, the wide-open country to the east. And then Patton arrived. He took command of the Third Army, a formation that existed more on paper than in reality, until the moment he touched it. Within 72 hours, it became the most dangerous military instrument in Western Europe. Patton did exactly what Rommel had predicted he would do. He ignored Brittany, the objective his superiors wanted him to secure. Instead, he pivoted east and raced inland with a speed that defied logistical sanity. His columns advanced 50, 60, 70 kilometers a day, bypassing German strongpoints, ignoring their flanks, trusting that speed and chaos would protect them better than caution ever could. His tanks did not stop for fuel. They refueled on the move. His infantry did not dig in at nightfall. They kept moving under cover of darkness. His engineers built bridges while under fire and had convoys rolling across them before the concrete set. In German headquarters, staff officers stared at maps covered in red arrows that seemed to grow longer every hour. Reunits reported American forces appearing in towns that should have been a week away. Communication lines collapsed as headquarters were overrun before they could evacuate. Patton's advance was not a military operation, it was a phenomenon, an eruption of mechanized violence that moved faster than the German command cycle could process. And Rommel, reading the reports from his own headquarters, felt the bitter satisfaction of a prophet whose warnings had been ignored.
He drafted another memorandum. In it, he laid out what was happening and what would happen next. Patton, he wrote, would not stop at the Loire. He would sweep east toward Paris, then wheel north to encircle the German forces still fighting in Normandy. If those forces attempted to retreat, they would collide with American spearheads cutting off their escape routes. If they stood and fought, they would be destroyed piecemeal. The only rational option was immediate withdrawal to the Seine, but that would mean abandoning France, and Hitler would never permit it. Rommel sent the memorandum up the chain of command. It was read, discussed, and dismissed. The Führer's orders were clear: counterattack, retake Avranches, cut off Patton's advance at its route, do not yield ground. Rommel knew it was suicide, but orders were orders. August 7th, 1944, Mortain. 4 panzer divisions smashed into the American lines near Mortain, aiming to recapture Avranches and sever Patton's supply lines. For 12 hours it seemed possible. German tanks broke through initial defenses. American units fell back. The sky was overcast, grounding Allied air power. Then the clouds lifted. What followed was annihilation. American fighter bombers appeared in waves, so many that they had to queue for attack runs. Rockets and bombs turned panzer columns into burning wrecks. German infantry, caught in the open, were shredded by strafing runs. The counterattack collapsed, and with it, any remaining hope of containing Patton. Because while the Wehrmacht spent itself at Mortain, Patton's tanks were already racing past Le Mans, past Chartres, past Orléans. His lead elements were 200 kilometers from Avranches, and they showed no sign of slowing. Behind them came supply columns stretching back to the coast, a river of trucks delivering the fuel, ammunition, and spare parts that kept the advance alive. American logistics, so often mocked by German officers as inelegant and wasteful, proved devastatingly effective. Patton could afford to waste fuel because he had so much fuel. He could afford casualties because replacements arrived faster than losses accumulated. He could afford risks because his supply chain could absorb mistakes that would have crippled a German formation. German commanders scrambled to respond. Units were pulled from quiet sectors and rushed toward the front, only to find that the front had moved again. Defensive lines were established, only to be bypassed. Ambushes were prepared, only to be bypassed. Patton did not fight for terrain, he fought from movement. Every kilometer he advanced was a kilometer the Germans had to defend, and Germany no longer had enough soldiers, tanks, or fuel to defend everything. In his headquarters, Rommel drafted yet another report. This one was blunt to the point of insubordination. The situation in France, he wrote, was no longer salvageable. Patton's breakout had turned the campaign into a war of pursuit, and Germany could not win a pursuit. The only rational course was immediate withdrawal to defensible positions along the German border. Every day spent fighting in France was a day wasted, men and material lost for no strategic purpose. The response came swiftly: do not withdraw, do not retreat, hold and counterattack. Rommel did not reply. There was nothing left to say. August 15th, 1944, Falaise. The trap Rommel had foreseen began to close. British and Canadian forces pressed south from Caen. American forces, spearheaded by Patton's armor, swept north from Le Mans. Between them, the bulk of the German 7th Army, 9 divisions, over 100,000 men, found itself in a shrinking pocket around the town of Falaise. Rommel was no longer there to witness it.
On July 17th, his staff car had been strafed by Allied fighters. He suffered a fractured skull and was evacuated to Germany. But even from a hospital bed, he could read the reports and understand what was happening. Patton's tanks reached Argentan, just 20 kilometers from the Canadian positions at Falaise. The pocket was almost sealed. Escape routes dwindled to narrow corridors clogged with desperate men, burning vehicles, and the remnants of once proud divisions. Allied artillery and air power pounded the pocket relentlessly. Horses lay dead in ditches. Tanks sat abandoned for lack of fuel. Soldiers who had survived 3 years of war walked into captivity with the blank expressions of men who had seen the end. The Falaise Pocket was not merely a defeat. It was the obliteration of Germany's capacity to defend France. Over 50,000 soldiers were captured. Thousands more died. The equipment losses were catastrophic. Tanks, artillery, trucks, all the machinery of modern war gone. The roads leading out of the pocket were littered with wreckage so dense that bulldozers had to clear paths for Allied vehicles to advance. And Patton, denied permission to close the pocket completely by his own superiors, pivoted east and resumed his race toward Germany. There is a photograph from late August 1944. It shows a dusty road somewhere in eastern France. On it, a column of American tanks stretches to the horizon, each one trailing a plume of dust. They are moving fast, as they always did under Patton. The image is grainy, black and white, the kind of photograph that could depict any army in any war.
But look closer. On the turret of the lead tank, an American flag snaps in the wind. On the side of another, someone has painted a nickname in white letters, "Hell on Wheels." These tanks are not pristine. They are scratched, dented, stained with mud and fuel, but they are moving, and that movement contains within it something more than mechanical energy. It is the manifestation of a philosophy, a way of war that Europe had never quite understood until it was too late. Patton did not invent this philosophy. He inherited it from a nation that believed stasis was death, that problems existed to be solved through action, that obstacles were temporary and hesitation was sin. American commanders did not ask, "Can this be done?" They asked, "How fast can we do it?" And when the answer was not fast enough, they found ways to do it faster. Rommel had understood this. He had tried to warn his superiors that they were not facing an army, but an idea. The idea that war could be won through relentless, unceasing aggression, backed by material abundance so vast it seemed almost obscene. A German panzer division, crippled by losses, would withdraw to refit. An American armored division, suffering similar casualties, would fold in replacements, requisition new tanks from depots overflowing with them, and resume the attack within days. The math was inescapable. Germany could not win a war of attrition against an enemy that treated attrition as an accounting problem. In September 1944, Patton's Third Army crossed into Germany. By then, it had advanced over 600 kilometers in a month, liberated most of France, and inflicted losses on the Wehrmacht would never be replaced. The war would continue for 8 more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Rommel did not live to see the end. In October, implicated in the failed plot to assassinate Hitler, he was given a choice: a show trial and execution, or suicide with assurances that his family would be spared. He took poison on October 14, 1944. The official story claimed he died of his injuries from the July attack. Germany mourned a hero. The truth was buried with him. But his predictions lived on, validated by every kilometer Patton's tanks traveled, every town the Third Army liberated, every German division that disintegrated under the weight of American firepower and mobility. Rommel had been right. High Command had laughed, not because his analysis was flawed, but because accepting it meant acknowledging that Germany had already lost. There is a recurring image in the memories of those who survived the Normandy campaign, German and Allied alike. It is not a battle or a place, but a sound. the growl of American engines, always moving, always multiplying, an industrial symphony that never paused, never relented, never gave ground it had taken. To the Americans, it was the sound of progress. To the Germans, it was the sound of inevitability. Patton understood what that sound represented. In a letter to his wife, written in the autumn of 1944, he reflected on the campaign with characteristic bluntness. "War," he wrote, "is not about who is right, it is about who is left." He didn't mean it cynically. He meant that victory belonged to those who could endure, who could replace losses, who could keep moving when everyone else had stopped. America, with its factories, its farms, its vast and untapped resources, could keep moving longer than any nation on Earth. Rommel had understood this too. He had faced it in the desert, where American supply convoys stretched back across the Mediterranean, seemingly inexhaustible. He had seen it in the hedgerows, where American artillery expended more shells in a day than German factories produced in a week. And he had predicted it would manifest most lethally in commanders like Patton, who grasped that modern war was not a duel between armies, but a contest of systems, industrial, logistical, philosophical, and that America's system was designed for this kind of war in a way Europe's was not. Epilogue. December 1944, the Ardennes. Snow falling through skeletal trees, muffling the sound of tank treads and bootsteps. Germany launched its final great offensive in the West, a desperate gamble aimed at splitting the Allied armies and recapturing Antwerp. For a week, it seemed possible. Allied lines buckled, units were surrounded, the weather grounded air support, nullifying one of the Allies' greatest advantages. And then Patton did what Rommel would have predicted he would do. He disengaged 3 divisions from an active offensive, pivoted them 90 degrees north, and marched them over 150 kilometers through winter storms to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. Logistics officers said it could not be done. Staff planners said it would take weeks. Patton did it in 4 days. The relief of Bastogne broke the back of the German offensive. Within a month, the Ardennes salient was eliminated. The road to Germany lay open once more. There is no evidence Rommel's ghost witnessed this, but one imagines somewhere in the cold soil of Swabia, where he was buried with full military honors, a flicker of grim vindication. He had told them, he had warned them, he had predicted exactly what would happen when you let a man like Patton loose with an army that never ran out of fuel, never ran out of ammunition, and never, ever stopped moving. High command had laughed. History did not. In the end, wars are not won by the generals who predict the future, but by the nations that create the conditions those predictions describe. Rommel saw what was coming because he understood the enemy he faced, not merely their tactics or their technology, but their spirit, their abundance, their unshakable belief that every problem could be solved if you threw enough steel and willpower at it. He tried to tell his superiors. They did not listen, not because he was wrong, but because the truth he spoke was unbearable, that Germany was fighting not just an army, but an idea that tanks should never stop, that supplies should never run short, and victory belonged to those who could move fastest and strike hardest, consequences be damned. Patton embodied that idea. Rommel understood it. The war played out exactly as the Desert Fox said it would. And no one can say they were not warned.